The naivety of people is sometimes astonishing. Often the worst and bloodiest atrocities could have been prevented, but they were simply ignored. And right now, a man who made dark jokes could be executing a cold-blooded murder plan just because everyone interpreted his remarks as just black humor. Brian Cohee Jr. was born on January 10, 2002, the son of Brian and Terry. He also had a younger brother. The family lived in Grand Junction, Colorado, USA. From a young age, Brian was diagnosed with an autism spectrum disorder and attention deficit disorder. Already in middle school, he began to develop antisocial behavior. He became an outsider, often confronting other students and causing them discomfort and aggression. Brian enjoyed humiliating other children and morally destroying them. He was very active on the internet, where his conversation partners became targets for bullying. All this happened both on social networks and at school. Over the years, his behavior worsened. In the yin class, his parents were once again called to school. The principal reported that the other students did not feel safe around Brian, a view shared by the teachers. The teenager constantly teased other students, insulted them in every conceivable way, and escalated conflicts to the point of physical fights. However, his mother and father believed that all this was greatly exaggerated. In 2018, Brian had his first trouble with the law. He was arrested for assault after he hit another student with a homemade weapon, severely injuring him. Following this, the teenager was suspended from school. This happened again in 2019 after he triggered a panic attack in another student who suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder. Brian knew exactly what he was doing. He deliberately exposed himself to this risk, but did not think about the consequences for his victim. That same year, he was again suspended when the high school student made inappropriate sexual remarks towards female students. From the onset of these disorders, Brian was obsessed with cruelty and violence, especially with serial killers. His idol was Jeffrey D., and he made no secret of his morbid inclinations. Other students nicknamed him D, and Brian reveled in that. In high school, one of his teachers found a diary in Brian's briefcase in which he kept detailed statistics about various serial killers. He was interested in how many people they killed and what their motives and methods were. He loved black humor and liked to tell bloody jokes. Despite all these disturbing facts, the teachers limited themselves to another call to his parents. Because of Brian's inappropriate behavior, he was transferred to another school for children with special needs. His mother and father thought this would help control their child's aggressive temperament. Previously, however, they had also taken him to a doctor to be examined and to find out how to handle the teenager's deviations. The staff at the medical center immediately realized that he should undergo a thorough examination to detect a possible psychosis. However, this diagnosis was never made as he refused hospitalization and an in-depth examination. He took prescribed medications for ADHD and anxiety, which barely helped him cope with his mental problems, especially during the transition period. Despite his condition and behavior, Brian still had a few friends. It was a small group of teenagers with whom he maintained friendships even after high school. They were all considered outsiders, but no one except Brian was so cruel. After graduating from high school, Brian got a job at a local grocery store. At that time, his parents divorced, and the troubled child stayed with his mother. His father visited him regularly, almost every day. Mother and father maintained a friendly relationship. The woman ran a kindergarten, and the father became self-employed making life jackets. The parents had enough money to support their son, but this had no impact on improving the teenager's condition. On the early morning of February 28, 2001, the police received an unusual call from a boatyard. The father of the 19-year-old Brian worked nearby. The young man had driven his car into the mud at the shore of the Colorado River, and then the vehicle was pulled into the water by a high bank. It fell in and sank a few meters deep. When the police arrived at the accident site, the young man was already there with his parents, as he had previously reported the situation to them. Also at the marina, concerned people were helping the drenched man to warm up. The police officers tried to find out how and why the young man was there at night. According to his statements, he needed privacy and peace and was therefore looking for a place where he could feel safe and be himself. However, the circumstances of the incident seemed too strange to the police officers. It looked as if Brian had intentionally driven the car backward into the water and then lost traction when he tried to drive away, causing the vehicle to roll into the river. Brian managed to get out of the sinking vehicle, but was completely drenched and risked hypothermia. As it turned out, he had arrived here in the late afternoon and stayed until dawn. It seemed strange that a young man of his age could not engage in anything other than such things. His parents explained to the police officers that he had developmental peculiarities and that it was therefore completely normal for him to be different. Brian wanted to call for help because it was February and cold. He was completely drenched and did not know how to get home. Unfortunately, his mobile phone was turned off. The man reached the street and wanted to get help from passing drivers, but there were no cars. 5 minutes later, a car with a father and his son inside pulled up in front of him. The men gave him a mobile phone with which Brian could call the police and his parents. To keep warm, the two men allowed Brian to sit in the car and gave him moral support. The young man was apparently in a very unpleasant situation and feared possible problems if his parents noticed that he had drowned the car. In fact, this strange accident was more of a laughingstock for the police officers. No one paid much attention to the sunken car. At the same time, Brian's parents sat on the dock, thinking about how they could get the car off the bottom. Brian Sr. operated his own business there, a place he knew well. The man knew that the problem could only be solved with machinery, since the shore was very steep. Unfortunately, it was too early to call a tow truck, and the sun was freezing and at risk of hypothermia. They called several towing companies until they finally found an available vehicle. The whole thing was dismissed as an amusing oddity, and the officers let the family go so that the parents could move and warm up their son. The officers returned to the boat dock to help tow the vehicle. The police officers' laughter turned to concern when the car was on land. They noticed something that looked like blood dripping from the bodywork. The officers immediately called Brian's father. The officers wanted to warn the parents that their son could be injured, as the young man might not have felt the injury due to hypothermia or adrenaline. This precaution seemed appropriate. The vehicle was simply returned to the family. The investigators did not conduct tests or take blood samples. The investigators could not even be sure whether it was blood or another liquid that only looked like it due to the color. As it turned out, Brian was not injured. Everything was dismissed as some kind of accident. But already the next day, on March 1st, law enforcement authorities realized their mistake. A woman named Monique called emergency services, reporting the disappearance of a man named Warren Barnes. She was the owner of a bridal shop near the place where the missing man often took a break. The two had become friends, as the man liked to read very much and often sat at the same spot near her shop. Warren was a homeless man, but pleasant and calm. Monique often talked with him and gave him small jobs so he could earn money for food and water. It turned out that he was quite well known in the city, especially because of his love for reading. Everyone knew him as a friendly, intelligent, and well-read person who was always ready to chat and help. Warren did not tell why he became homeless, but everyone knew he had a difficult fate. On March 1st, Monique reported that she had last seen the man on February 27th around 5 a.m. He usually came before the store opened, chatted with her, drank a coffee, and picked up his assignment for the day. They had arranged to meet the next day, but the missing person did not show up on February 28th. Monique turned to the police because Warren's wallet was found in the boathouse. Inside was the phone number of a woman who was contacted because she wanted to return the wallet. This worried her, of course. Warren had always been responsible and taken his work seriously. When the man helped Monique in the store doing helpful work, he had never been late or missed a day in the 2 years of their cooperation. Only twice had he not appeared, and on those occasions, he had announced his absence in advance. Moreover, The woman found the place where the wallet was found strange because Warren did not own a car and had no reason to drive there. Additionally, the place was far enough away. The drive from his place of residence took about an hour and a half. The woman was immediately concerned about this circumstance and suspected that something bad might have happened to her assistant and friend. She handed the investigators a single photo of Warren that was taken several years before his disappearance. Strangely, the man's wallet was found by Brian Sr., whose business was near the boathouse. Even more amusing was the fact that the wallet was found in his son Brian Jr.'s car shortly after the vehicle was pulled out by a tow truck. When his father asked the teenager about the wallet, the young man confirmed that he had found it at the gas station and wanted to return it to the owner, but had simply forgotten due to the events of the previous day. However, the parents did not believe their son because, in addition to the wallet, they found latex gloves and a large kitchen knife with traces that suspiciously looked like bloodstains. They knew of Brian's strange behavior and his tendencies and could not understand why he had taken another's wallet into his car. That afternoon, Brian Jr. wanted to go for a walk to a friend and disappeared. His mother could not get the matter of the wallet and the disappearance of the homeless man out of her mind and decided to rummage around his room. She quickly found something that made her scream in horror. In Brian Jr.'s wardrobe, a human head was found hidden in a large plastic bag. Next to it was another similar bag, but the woman simply did not have the strength to open them and explore the contents. She just took both bags and placed them in the kitchen sink before calling her ex-husband. The woman was sure that her son had killed the man. The parents called Brian and asked him to come home immediately. They remained calm and did not want to talk about what they had found in his room. His father said he needed to get the keys for the drowned car, and the young man, who knew nothing, left the house. As he was in the family's driveway, several police cars had already driven into the driveway. They arrived quickly and caught the young man on the street in front of the house. Brian was immediately asked why his parents might be concerned and why they would call the police. The boy casually replied that they had probably found a severed human head and hands in his wardrobe. He then calmly confessed to the murder. Brian Jr. did not resist and cooperated willingly with the investigation. He voluntarily got into the police officer's car and drove to the interrogation at the station. They did not even put handcuffs on him. He appeared generally cheerful and seemed satisfied with the situation. While Brian was very calm, his mother was hysterical. The ex-husband did his best to calm the grieving woman. The parents were just trying to come to terms with the fact that their son was now a murderer. After Brian was driven to the station, one of the investigators stayed to talk with the man's parents. They recounted the events of the last 24 hours of their lives, the situation with the car and the wallet. According to the father, the mother simply did not believe her son's version about the wallet. So she decided to search his room in the hope of finding something else suspicious and figuring out how something like blood could be on the bodywork. She had a bad feeling and made a horrifying discovery. According to the man, he was the one who found the wallet in the car, and inside were Warren's ID and Monique's phone number. The man immediately called the woman, who was an acquaintance of the missing man and who could return the wallet to the owner. At that point, he learned that Warren had not shown up for work and was being sought. Consequently, his son denied any frightening suspicion of his parents. They talked to him, but he dismissed it with various excuses. During the interrogation, Brian Jr. behaved extremely calmly, so the police began to question him with the simplest questions to assess his health status, psyche, and past experiences. For an ordinary criminal without mental problems, he behaved much too calmly. The heinous crime he had committed did not seem to disturb him in the least. He described in great detail what had happened and was even proud or boastful about it. He made jokes the evening of February 27th that he had been in the car and emphasized that he was in a very bad mental state. He heard voices that prompted him to look for a victim. Around 11 p.m., Brian drove under a bridge near the sheriff's office. When he noticed a tarp under which a homeless person was sleeping, he thought that would fit well. Brian stopped, put on 3-layer gloves and a Michael Myers mask, and took a knife. He got out of the car, went over, and tore off the tarp. Then he began to stab the homeless person in the head and neck without warning. His victim was Warren, who tried to defend himself and kept asking why he was doing this. Brian did not listen to him and dealt him blow after blow. According to his own calculations, he must have inflicted 30 to 40 stab wounds on his body before he stopped. The murderer repeated a phrase like a mantra, dirty, stinking, really disgusted by his victim. When the massacre was over, the man showed no signs of life. Brian reported that he was sweating, but was surprised how easy it was to kill a man. When he finished the execution, the victim's head was almost detached from the body. Then he decided to look at the internal organs and open the abdomen. In the next phase, he separated the hands and beheaded Warren. Finally, after previously giving him a so-called Glasgow smile by cutting his mouth from ear to ear, he did so, but this was only part of the mutilations that posthumously disfigured the deceased. Brian could not even list the ways he mutilated the body of an innocent man after having had his fun. The perpetrator took photos of the corpse and the crime scene, which were later deleted from his mobile phone. Experts were able to recover these images. The horrific details of the senseless execution were revealed. Then he cut out his victim's eyes, separated the hands from the body, and placed them in a bag. The head was also placed in an identical sack. He put everything in the trunk of his car and drove home. There, Brian cleaned the trophies into the wardrobe, cleaned the knife, and washed his clothes. According to the man's confession, he made animal noises during the massacre and growled later. Many people from his environment later confirmed that they had repeatedly observed such behavior in the perpetrator. Brian emphasized that he felt no remorse or pity, which was a clear expression of his indifference. He was even proud of his act, as he could join his idols. Most of the interrogation time, the young man smiled broadly. The investigators were shocked by the details of the crime and the joy with which Brian described everything. It seemed as if he wanted to remember every detail of the murder to immortalize himself as a madman. He even drew a rough map of the bridge and the crime scene from a bird's-eye view. Eventually, the investigators realized that he was simply reliving the moment of the murder in this way, which gave him great pleasure. According to Brian, he intended to hide the head in a paint bucket and throw it away, and also get rid of the hands in another part of the city, but he had no time. The murderer admitted that he was paranoid and therefore noticed that he had torn one of his gloves during the attack, but this only became apparent to him later. The man did not want to be caught, so he returned to the crime scene to recover the body. With him, he drove to the coast to the boat dock, but after he threw Warren into the water, he could no longer drive away. His car skidded on the wet ground and crashed into the river, so he had to call for help. After the crime was reported, the young man's car was examined more thoroughly, and the police found much more blood traces than originally assumed. However, this evidence was no longer as important since the investigations had the severed body parts of the deceased and the murderer's confession, which were recorded and documented. During the entire interrogation, Brian not only smiled, but constantly made gruesome jokes about his victim. His parents had often heard such humorous sketches from their son, but never suspected that he was actually capable of such things. His mother knew of the young man's fascination with serial killers, but did not take this attraction seriously. Although Brian was obsessed with them and considered them idols, she even gave him a book about the work of criminologists and murder investigations in the hope that it would help channel his morbid desires in a constructive direction. She hoped that instead of just being fascinated by serial killers, he could become a successful investigator. But unfortunately, her plan did not work and only helped him prepare to kill a homeless man. After the interrogation, the police spoke with Brian's girlfriend, with whom he had spent time on the day of his arrest. Her name was Keelan. She had been in contact with the arrested person since 9th grade and described him as a very closed person who liked to make provocative jokes and had a pronounced sense of black humor. Shortly before the act, Brian even confessed to her that he wanted to kill a homeless person because no one would look for such a person. But this was, as always, taken as another joke. The same group of Brian's friends found themselves among outsiders. They did not fit into society, so they formed their own little meeting point where everyone felt comfortable. At the same time, the other members of this group never took his murder thoughts seriously despite their shared love for black humor. No one except Brian would kill people. The boy's parents paid little attention to his behavior at school and even believed that the teachers were deliberately putting him down among the other students. At the same time, one day, a meeting with the teachers took place at school who were very worried about the safety of the students and themselves. They agreed to keep a closer eye on Brian. This happened after he repeatedly expressed his admiration for the cunningness of school shootings. However, no one reported the potential danger emanating from the teenager. When the police came into Brian's diary, in which he kept statistics about serial killers, his criminal plan became clear. The investigators also uncovered his criminal plan. It turned out that he had devised a terrifying plan that involved breaking into a house, killing adults and children, then stealing valuables and leaving the crime scene. He was to use a hunting knife and a .45 caliber revolver. Fortunately, Brian had no more time to carry out his plan. The diary also described the reasons for his belief in natural evil that he had created himself to justify future atrocities. The police were amazed that all these entries had been seen by the school's teachers. His parents and friends knew about it, but no one went to the police and no one insisted on compulsory treatment of the young man. All this led to a bloody massacre. Although the law enforcement authorities possessed Warren's severed body parts, his body was still not found. The search in the water continued, but apparently not intensely enough. The police had enough evidence in their possession, including Brian's confession, to charge him with murder. In conversation with the investigators, Brian admitted that he had been planning the crime for about 6 months. He was well-versed in forensics and knew that homeless people are a high-risk group whose deaths and disappearances are followed with little interest. Brian had even considered leaving the body at the massacre site, but then reconsidered, again thanks to the book his mother had once given him. Brian's assumption that homeless people were treated with less attention proved correct, but an accident got in the way and exposed him. If it had not been the accident in which Brian drowned the car, this could have been the perfect murder. Fortunately, everything turned out well so that he was exposed and a family could be saved from death. The investigators checked the young man's browser data and found that his internet activities had increased significantly in the last year before the massacre, especially his interest in anything related to crime. At the same time, he struggled with his mental problems and read a lot about paranoid and schizoid personality disorders. On February 28th, the day after the murder, he searched for information on how to delete data from an Android phone and how to dispose of biological waste. Brian admitted that he had never been seriously diagnosed, but was sure that he suffered from schizophrenia. He claimed he had delusions and was obsessed with the idea that everyone was watching him, even the birds. Based on these statements, the police were very cautious in dealing with the man because they feared he might try to evade responsibility for his actions by claiming insanity. Brian did not stop at the detailed description of the murder of the man. He confessed that he had killed a cat on Halloween 2018. The man had caught the stray animal, put it in a bag, and mistreated it for a long time, beating and trampling it before killing it. Then Brian beheaded the animal and hid the head in the house. As the remains began to rot and smell foul, he simply threw them away. It was rumored that many people knew about the incident, but Brian did not receive any punishment. During the interrogation, the prisoner simply was not to be stopped. He told one strange story after another. According to him, his parents had found a series of tools in his room shortly before the murder, including hammers, shovels, knives, cable ties, a saw, tape, and ropes. Brian did not hide that all of this was intended to kill people. His mother and father insisted that he get rid of all these items. Otherwise, they would have been forced to go to the police. Even at this point, they still believed that Brian was not capable of committing crimes. According to his diary entries, he had originally intended to find an escort lady to lure molest, and kill her. He wanted to keep the woman captive and torture her. Brian believed that no one would search for such women and homeless people, but then he changed his mind and chose the second option. Brian claimed that doing evil did not provide him with any sexual satisfaction. When asked about his motive, he said he admired murderers and was fascinated by their acts, that they could take a life, and decided that he was no worse than them and wanted to try. During the investigation, a Reddit account of Brian was discovered where he posted comments about his views and his life philosophy and about the murders. He philosophized about nothing. None of it seemed as compromising as his narratives, but it left a lasting impression of brutality in the man's mind. In one of the last entries, he regretted the murder but expressed himself as if he was not disturbed by the fact that he had taken an innocent life but that he had been caught. In January 2022, the court ordered that Brian Cohee undergo a psychiatric evaluation. He still did not feel guilty for his act, but was clearly unhappy about his imprisonment and the prospect of spending many decades behind bars. Together with his lawyer, he tried to prove his insanity. Nevertheless, the psychiatrist declared him competent. The prosecution had a solid evidence base in the form of body parts, evidence, and the defendant's confession. The victim's body was never found. During the entire trial, Brian smiled a lot. In the end, he was found guilty of first-degree murder and withholding evidence. Brian was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole and an additional 13 years. The judge who announced the verdict in this case said that this case had been the most cruel and inhumane of his career. Despite the brutality of the tragedy and the senselessness of the murder, the media actively followed the rumors, sparking a wave of outrage against Brian but also support. A woman who was friends with the deceased and supported him erected a small memorial site with books in his memory. Thank you for watching and take care.